A locked room. No windows, no witnesses, yet a body lies cold. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Your comments always make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. The rain had begun in the early evening, one of those steady Paris rains that blurred the outlines of the buildings and muffled the street sounds. From the window of his office at the Quai d'Orfèvre, Maigret watched it with a sort of absent-minded patience. He had not taken off his overcoat and his pipe was unlit, held loosely between two fingers. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of tobacco that had burned out half an hour ago. On his desk, the telephone sat inert, waiting. He was not waiting for anything in particular, only allowing the minutes to accumulate, the way one does when the weather and the city seem to move more slowly than usual. He had left Madame Maigret at home with the promise of returning in time for supper, but he already knew he would be late. There was no real case pressing on him at that moment, only an itch, a murmur that had reached him that afternoon from one of the commissariats. A body found in a small boarding house, an unremarkable death on the surface. Nothing sensational, nothing to stir the journalists, but something in the tone of the officer who had telephoned him, some hesitation, had lodged itself in Maigret's mind. He lit his pipe at last and drew in the smoke, watching the thin plume twist toward the ceiling. Outside, the Seine pressed against the quays, restless under the rain. He thought of the boarding house in the 11th arrondissement, a place he knew only vaguely. Rue de Charonne or near enough, streets with grocers' shops still open at night, children running barefoot in courtyards, a smell of boiled cabbage in the stairwells. The kind of place where people lived half in the shadows, half in resignation. He took his hat and umbrella without hurry, as though the act itself were a concession. On the stairwell of the Prefecture, he met Inspector Lognon, who looked as if the rain had already soaked through his clothes, though he had not yet been outside. "You're going out, Chief?" Lognon asked, his tone both respectful and faintly resentful. "Just a look," Maigret replied. He had no desire to explain more. The car brought him through the dripping streets, headlights casting blurred streaks against the slick pavement. Paris seemed to have shrunk into itself, each café glowing like a lantern, each doorway sheltering someone waiting for the rain to relent. When he reached the street, the boarding house did not stand out. It was like a dozen others, narrow, with peeling paint and shutters that had not closed properly in years. A gendarme stood at the entrance, cap pulled low, his uniform already damp. He recognized Maigret, straightened, and murmured, "Second floor, Chief." The staircase smelled of damp wood and cooking oil. The banister was sticky under Maigret's palm. From one of the rooms came the sound of a radio turned low, playing a chanson whose refrain was muffled by the walls. He climbed slowly, not because of fatigue, but because he preferred to arrive with a certain heaviness, to let those inside feel his presence before he spoke. At the landing, the door to the room was open. Inside, a lamp had been turned on, its yellow glow catching the outline of a small iron bed, a wardrobe that leaned against the wall, and a table with a bottle and two glasses. The body lay on the bed, still dressed. A man of about 50, hair already greying, his face turned slightly toward the wall as if he had lain down to rest. Nothing violent in the position, nothing alarming, except for the fact that the windowless rooms seemed to press in too closely, the air too stale. The concierge, a woman with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, stood near the doorway, twisting her hands in her apron. She whispered something to the uniformed sergeant, who nodded but did not reply. Maigret did not speak right away. He let the silence grow, filling the small room. He walked over to the table, lifted one of the glasses, sniffed it, and set it down again without comment. The man's shoes, neatly placed under the bed, were dry, too dry for a night of rain. He turned at last toward the concierge. "You found him?" She nodded, eyes flicking toward the floor. "Yes, monsieur." "He hadn't come down all day." I thought I should look." Her voice trailed off, uncertain, as though she had said too much or too little. Maigret regarded her for a moment, pipe smoke curling around his face, then looked again at the body that lay so quietly in the room with no windows. Something was wrong here. Not in the obvious sense, no knife, no broken glass, but in the way the silence pressed against the walls, the way the air seemed to resist being breathed. He felt the first stirrings of the case, not in his mind, but in the weight that settled on his shoulders, the sense that he had stepped into a place where ordinary life had faltered, and no one quite dared to name why. He did not move for a while after the concierge finished speaking. The sergeant shifted his weight, the floorboard complained, the radio down the hall sighed into a refrain and fell quiet. Maigret set his hat on the table beside the bottle and 2 glasses, then bent over the body, as if to look at a sleeping man. The face had a slight droop at the mouth, a man who had been handsome and now was not. The eyelids had the faint, bruised look of someone who did not sleep well. He touched the sleeve of the jacket. Cool. The fabric had a faint smell of wool that had not been in the rain. He did not touch the pockets yet. Who was he? He asked without looking up. Martin, the concierge said, then corrected herself softly. He signed as Jules Martin. He paid by the week. 3 weeks now. You told the sergeant you looked for him because he hadn't come down all day. Yes, monsieur. Does he usually? She swallowed. He goes out. Morning, sometimes evenings, visitors, a pause, a tightening of the shawl. I perhaps once or twice. I don't watch the doors, monsieur. He nodded as if she had answered a different question. He crouched to peer under the bed. The shoes were lined neatly heel to heel. They were clean, polished, the leather unscuffed, soles without grit. Shoes tell things. He slid one out and turned it in his palm. The stitches along the welt were sharp, a repair done not long ago. He set it back exactly as he'd found it, then opened the wardrobe. Shirts, 2 carefully pressed, a spare tie, a pair of socks folded in the old-fashioned way, a razor with a case. Tucked in the corner, a packet from a launderer near Nation, a paper band with a rubber stamp. He did not take it. He only read it with his eyes and closed the wardrobe again with a gentleness that could have been respect. The 2 glasses on the table were not identical. One had a chip on the rim. The other was clearer, newer. He lifted the chipped one to his nose. A Nice. The other held only the ghost of it. He breathed once, a patient intake as if testing the air. The bottle was an ordinary one sold everywhere. The level was just below half. He put it back and wiped a drop of condensation from the table with his thumb. The lamp hissed faintly. Has the doctor been called? He asked. He is on his way, the sergeant answered. Should I? Quietly, Maigret said. To the concierge, more softly, where is his coat? She pointed to a hook behind the door. The overcoat hung there, heavy and dark, with the faint damp of stairwell air, not rain. He pressed 2 fingers to the hem. Cold but not soaked. No umbrella? He had one. He asked, still looking at the fabric. Yes, a black one. Curved handle. She looked at her hands. I haven't seen it today. He turned toward the bed again. The man lay on top of the coverlet, not undressed. Someone tired would have at least unbuttoned his collar, but the top button was still fastened. The tie loose only by a finger's width. It suggested a pause, a man who lay down intending to get up again. He slid a hand into the jacket pocket slowly like a favor. A matchbook from a cafe on the Rue du Chemin Vert, 6 matches left, and a slip of paper torn from a receipt block with a penciled 18/030. He set them on the table. In the breast pocket, a wallet, 2 notes, some coins, a work card with no employer's stamp, a photograph cut down to fit, just an oval of a woman's face, eyes looking off to the side, blurred at the edges as if from a cheap enlarger. No papers that anchored him. These men often kept their names like coats they could change. The air in the room was the sort that clung to the throat. He opened the door to the corridor and stood there, occupying the frame. A draught wandered past him. From the closet he saw a grate the size of a postcard, a ventilation opening with newspaper stuffed into it, the print yellowed but recent. He pulled a corner free. The paper crackled and bent back on itself. The smell shifted, a whisper of old cabbage from somewhere below, and the stale tang of the room eased a fraction. He let the paper go and it sagged back into place. Do you keep a register? He asked the concierge. In the lodge, she said, already retreating as if grateful to move away from the bed. He followed her down a flight, the stair treads groaning as if each step remembered someone heavier. Her lodge was a glassed-in booth, smelling of boiled potatoes and damp wool. On the shelf lay a notebook with marbled paper, a stub of pencil tucked between the pages. She opened it to a page with 3 names, 2 crossed out with careful lines and Jules Martin, written twice over 2 weeks. The handwriting was neat, measured. The address given at admission was nothing, a street with a number that could have been invented. Under profession, she had written representative, then drawn a line as if the word could be anything. Who else lives on his floor? Mademoiselle Lee's opposite. She works nights at an office typing. The old metal worker in the corner room. And the young man in number 6, but he is hardly ever home. You saw Mr. Martin yesterday? He came in late. I heard his step. I think I heard a second step. It could have been another tenant. One cannot be sure. You hear everything, madam, he said, not unkindly. Her eyes moistened, not out of sentiment, but because the lodge was hot. I hear too much, she admitted. He returned upstairs. At the landing, a door opened a finger's width and closed again. He knocked, waited, then knocked once more with the weight of his knuckles. Mademoiselle Lise appeared, pale, hair pulled back, a cardigan wrapped round her like a question. I won't take much of your time, he said. He did not ask to enter. He stood where he was, hat in hand. Did you see anyone go into number 4 last night? She looked at his hat, his face somewhere in between. A man, she said at last. I didn't see his face. He wore a hat like other men. He carried something under his arm. A newspaper, perhaps. He coughed once here. She touched her throat, indicating a dry, habitual cough. I heard them talking, not loud. Then the door shut, and I put a pillow over my head. I had to sleep. And today, I left at 8, came back at 6. There was no sound. I thought he had gone out. Maigret thanked her and moved on to the corner room. The metal worker, a square man with the flat gaze of someone who had spent too many hours facing heat, nodded. He was the quiet sort, he said. Took off his shoes before the door closed. He scratched his cheek. But the visitor last night, he didn't. He walked like a man who wanted the floor to hear him. What time? After 9. I was listening to the news. The announcer was speaking of a train delay, and that's when the step came. And this morning? The man shook his head. I leave early. I didn't see him. On the way back to the room, Maigret stopped midway on the stair and listened. The house breathed in its small way. Water went through a pipe like a tired violin. Someone coughed behind a door, dry, quick, an old habit. He went back into number 4, closed the door, and the stale air fell over him again like a blanket. He took off his overcoat and settled onto the chair against the wall. The sergeant glanced at him. Maigret made a small motion with 2 fingers. Wait. He filled his pipe without lighting it, as if it were only something to hold. On the table the matchbook lay open, a small mouth of cardboard, 1830, it was now past 9. The doctor would come, the formalities would arrange themselves, but the room itself would keep saying what it had to say. He sat, breathing slowly, letting the minutes thicken into presence. Downstairs the street door creaked, a sound that belonged to that door and no other. Footsteps on the first flight, light at first, then pausing, then 1 step more. They hesitated on the landing as if measuring the darkness. He didn't move. He only turned his head toward the crack at the bottom of the door. The shadow of the corridor dimmed and brightened, and a faint smell slid through the threshold, cheap cologne and the damp of a wool sleeve. The footsteps retreated a single stair, then stopped entirely, as if the person had remembered something important and could not decide whether to come back for it. The shadow at the bottom of the door lingered for what felt like a full minute, though it could only have been a handful of breaths. Maigret sat without moving, the unlit pipe resting between his fingers, his gaze steady on that thin line of darkness. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the shadow withdrew. He heard the faint creak of the stairs under weight, being carefully lifted away. The sound of someone trying not to be heard, and succeeding only in making their absence conspicuous. The stairwell settled again into silence, broken only by the low hum of the radio farther down the hall. Maigret rose, his chair legs scraping softly against the worn boards. He opened the door and looked into the corridor. Nothing. Only the dim glow from a bulb in the ceiling, its glass yellowed by age, giving the hallway a permanent dusk. The air still carried the faint trace of cheap cologne, mixed with the damp wool smell he had already noticed. He leaned against the frame, listening again. Somewhere below, the concierge's voice floated up briefly, before being swallowed by the building's thick walls. Whoever had paused outside this room had either gone down or retreated into one of the other apartments. The sergeant shifted, uneasy. "Shall I—" he began. "No," Maigret said, his tone mild but final. He lit his pipe at last, the first drawer filling the room with a richer smoke that overpowered the stale odor lingering there. He took his time, standing in the doorway, as if the act of smoking itself were part of the investigation. He had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than questions. Doubt forced them to measure their words before they came out, or to blurt them out carelessly. Either way, the truth often slipped through. From the landing, the door opposite opened again. Mademoiselle Lise leaned against the frame, cardigan drawn tight, her eyes darting past Maigret to the body inside. She had not spoken long before, but now her lips parted as if some thought had been gnawing at her. "Inspector," she said softly. "He didn't have many visitors. But that man last night, it wasn't the first time." Maigret waited. He did not encourage nor interrupt. "I heard the cough before, twice, always late when the house is quiet. The steps were heavier this time, though. As if he didn't care who heard." She hesitated, then added, "And once I saw—" The man's sleeve. Grey, shiny from wear. Like the sleeves the clerks have when they keep their coats too long. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady, as though telling it relieved some weight. Maigret inclined his head, a gesture of thanks, and she retreated quickly, closing her door as if to seal away what she had revealed. The sergeant scribbled in his notebook, eager to make something of the detail. But Maigret only drew on his pipe, letting the smoke coil slowly toward the ceiling. Details had a way of arranging themselves if one didn't rush them. The doctor arrived shortly after, umbrella dripping onto the mat, his bag bumping against his knee. He greeted Maigret with the brisk professionalism of a man who had seen too many small rooms and too many quiet bodies. He bent over the man on the bed, examined the eyes, lifted the wrist, pressed at the throat. The whole procedure was swift, almost perfunctory. "Dead since late yesterday evening," he pronounced. "Possibly after supper. Heart, perhaps. There are no marks. No struggle." He tapped the chest lightly. "But I cannot be certain without more." Maigret nodded. "More will come." His eyes returned to the table with the bottle and the 2 glasses. Would a heart give him time to pour 2 drinks? The doctor glanced at the glasses without answering. He packed his instruments and left, already late for his next call. When the room settled again, Maigret pulled the chair nearer to the table and sat. He stared at the slip of paper with its penciled time, 1830. There was no name, no place. A rendezvous. The kind that could mean nothing or everything. The matchbook beside it carried the name of a cafe that would still be open. He imagined its mirrors streaked with smoke, its zinc counter, the smell of damp coats and strong coffee. The sergeant was shifting again, restless. "Shall we take the body down, Chief?" "Not yet." But the men— "Not yet." Maigret's voice had the weight of stone. The sergeant subsided. Maigret knew that before the body was removed, before the room was stripped of its living traces, he had to let the silence work on the people who still lingered around it. That shadow in the corridor, the cough, the cologne, they would circle back. He rose again, crossed the small room and leaned out the windowless doorframe into the corridor. The smell of the building had grown familiar. Cabbage, soap, rusted metal. He heard the concierge climbing, her slippers flapping faintly. She arrived with her shawl slipping from one shoulder. "Monsieur, will it be much longer?" she asked. Her voice had the fatigue of someone who had lived too long in stairwells. "Tell me," Maigret said, "did Mr. Martin receive letters?" She blinked. "Letters? No, none that I saw. The postman comes at noon. He leaves what is for the house with me. Nothing for number 4. No packages? No messages left with you?" Her eyes darted, uncertain. "Perhaps once a man asked if he was here. I said yes. The man went up. He stayed only an hour. He left quietly." "When?" she thought, tugging at the shawl. "A week ago, maybe more. Time runs together. Time runs together. Time—" "Would you know him again?" Her mouth tightened. "He wore a hat, that was all." In Paris, everyone wore a hat. Maigret let her go, and when she had gone down the stairs, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, pipe smoke drifting. The building seemed to hold its breath. Behind the closed doors, he sensed ears pressed to panels, bodies leaning still, waiting for him to leave so they could whisper again. At last he returned inside. The sergeant straightened. "Shall I watch the door, Chief?" "Do that." Maigret settled once more into the chair, the slip of paper with its penciled hour between his fingers. It was damp with the sweat of someone's hand, not yet smudged. It had been written quickly, carelessly. He pictured the man with the grey sleeve, the cough, the smell of cologne. waiting at a cafe table at 6:30, glancing toward the door. The pieces did not fit neatly. The shoes too clean for the night's weather, the missing umbrella, the room sealed with newspaper over its only breath of air, and a body that looked more at rest than abandoned. It was not the contradictions that interested him. They were always there. It was the silences between them. He filled his pipe again, though it was still warm, and said quietly to the sergeant, "We will see who comes back, for in places like this, Maigret knew shadows did not linger by chance. They belonged to someone who had left something unfinished in the room with no windows." The stair creaked again, this time with a weight that did not try so hard to hide itself. Maigret stood where he was in the doorway, pipe cupped in his palm, and waited. A hat brim appeared first, then a face that tried to organize itself into indifference and failed around the eyes. The grey sleeve was there, shiny at the elbow from years of rubbing a desk edge, and the faint, persistent cough like a habit that had outlived its owner's attempts to cure it. "You're looking for number 4, Maigret said. The man paused, as if measuring whether to retreat or bluff his way through. Yes, he answered, and the cheap cologne lifted again from his collar. "Is he in?" "Come in," Maigret said, as if it were a courtesy he extended routinely. He stepped aside. The man crossed the threshold and stopped. The room received him with its stale air and the shape on the bed. His mouth opened a little, the sound he made too small to be a word. "You knew him," Maigret said. The man's eyes did not leave the bed. "We had an appointment," he said finally. 6:30. His gaze fell to the slip of paper on the table, and he seemed to recognize his own handwriting without touching it. "He didn't come." "Yet you came later," Maigret said mildly. "After 9. The man's hand rose to his throat as if to catch the cough and put it back. "I passed by," he said. "I thought perhaps—" He let the rest of the sentence die, a habit of someone trained to leave things suggested rather than said. His age was difficult to place. The wornness of his clothes made him older, the quickness of his eyes younger. "What do you call him?" Maigret asked. The man blinked. "Call him?" "When you speak to him." "What name?" He swallowed. "Renaud," he said, and then, as if the name had betrayed him, he added, "It's how he introduced himself to me. Georges Renaud. Not Jules Martin." "No," the man said, and a look of obscure relief passed over his features, as if the responsibility for a lie lay squarely with the dead. "And you are?" He hesitated, then gave it up. "Vecher. Adrian. I'm with Duhamel and Fils Insurance," he said, and the cuff of his sleeve with its shine made sense. "Collections. Small policies. I call in the evenings because that is when people are home. You collect here often?" "Once a week." He paid irregularly. He looked again at the bed. He didn't seem the careless kind. He counted every franc twice. "You met him at the café on the Rue du Chemin Vert?" "The Café du Chemin Vert," he corrected, as if the exact article mattered. "There are too many people in the lodge downstairs in the evenings. Up here, the walls listen. At the café, we could talk like anyone." "You argued," Maigret said. "It wasn't a question." Vacher shifted. "We discussed an overdue premium," he said. "He was stubborn. And last night, he didn't come at 6:30. I waited until 7. Then I went on to 2 addresses near the boulevard. That 9 I passed by again. I thought, perhaps he had returned directly here and forgotten me." He coughed a dry bark. I knocked, no answer. "I didn't insist." "You spoke with him in this room another night," Maigret said. Vacher's glance flicked to the door opposite in the corridor, as if he could see through wood. "Once," he admitted. He was nervous about being seen at the café by someone who shouldn't see him. He hesitated. "By a woman, perhaps." The word hung there and seemed to make the air denser. "Describe her," Maigret said, and Vacher spread his fingers a little helplessly. "I never saw her. Only that he spoke of her like a man who was not finished with his past." Maigret turned the slip with the penciled hour toward the light, then set it down again. "You wrote this?" "Yes, and what did he owe you?" "A small capital, death benefit, barely enough to bury a man decently." He colored slightly. "We sell people the idea that they can spare their loved ones the indignity of a public burial." He liked the idea. Vacher's eyes went once more to the bed. He was alone, I think. He spoke as if there were no one. "Alone men often pretend there are people to spare," Maigret said. He studied Vacher in silence. The man endured it, his hand hovering between his chest and his throat, as if the cough were a bird he might still catch. In the folds of his scarf, the wool was matted where it rubbed his collarbone. The hat was brushed clean but old. "Your umbrella," Maigret said at last. "Did you leave with one last night?" I carry mine," Vacher said, hand to the handle, reassuring himself. "Black, curved, like his." "I didn't see his," Vacher said too quickly. "He had one," Maigret said. "It is not here." Vacher's gaze darted to the hook and away like a fish's quick turn. "If he went out, his shoes are dry." Vacher's eyes lingered at last on the shoes peering from under the bed. They were polished to a modest shine, the kind a man gives himself after supper out of habit. "You will write your name and address for my sergeant," Maigret said. He did not raise his voice. "You will not go far until I speak to you again." Vacher nodded too eagerly, already reaching for the pencil. His handwriting lay beside his earlier figures, slightly trembling now. When he left, he moved quickly, the cough running after him down the stairs like a small dog. The sergeant looked at Maigret. "Shall I follow him, Chief?" "No," Maigret said. "Not yet. He will go where he always goes." He stood a while, then took his hat and coat. "Stay," he told the sergeant. "No one moves the body. No one touches the table. If the concierge brings anyone up, stop them and send them down again." Outside, the rain had settled into its patient drumming. The street shone under the lamps, pedestrians leaning into their collars, the world hunched and communal. At the Café du Chemin Vert, the zinc counter glowed like a dull coin, and the mirrors held the city in damp fragment. The man behind the bar wiped the same patch of metal as if he were polishing a memory. He looked up when Maigret entered, not intimidated, just prepared. "You have a customer," Maigret said, showing the matchbook between two fingers without letting it be taken. "He comes at 6:30. Grey coat, quiet, sometimes with a clerk who coughs." The barman considered, then nodded. "He sits there," he said, pointing to a small table near the wall where the damp from the door never quite reaches. "Always the anisey. He warms his hands around the glass before he drinks." He looked at Maigret's hat, then at his face. "Last night he waited. Then the other came and they spoke in low voices. It wasn't an argument. It had the shape of one, but none of the sound. What did they call each other?" The barman's eyes moved as if watching the scene replay in the mirror. "The clerk called him Georges," he said. "The quiet man called the other Adrien. He thanked him like someone thanks a man for coming, when he would prefer he hadn't. They left together. The quiet one left first. The clerk finished his drink and looked at the door a long time before following. It was a little after 7. He hesitated, then added, "The quiet man borrowed an umbrella from the rack. He said he would bring it back." The barman gestured to a row of battered canes and sticks behind the coats. An empty notch gaped like a missing tooth. Maigret stood there in the warm fog of wet wool and coffee, thinking of the room with no windows and the dry shoes under the bed. He could hear the rain against the awning like the tapping of patient fingers. "Did he bring it back?" he asked. "Not yet," Maigret nodded once. He left a card on the counter without looking at it and stepped out under the awning, where the city's breath rose from the pavement. Somewhere behind him, the mirror resumed holding faces. Somewhere ahead, a man named something other than Jules Martin had carried a borrowed umbrella through the rain and not returned it. On the way back to the boarding house, Maigret walked slowly, as if the distance between the café and the room itself had something to say if only one listened with the right kind of silence. The walk back from the café was not far, yet Maigret stretched it, his steps unhurried. The rain had eased into a mist, but the streets still glistened as if varnished, and he kept his pipe unlit in his pocket, preferring to breathe in the damp night air. He passed the bakery shutters closed tight, the faint perfume of yeast still clinging to the cracks, then a tailor's shop where a mannequin slouched in half-darkness with a waistcoat draped over its shoulders. He was thinking less of places than of movements. The ordinary gestures of a man who borrows an umbrella and does not return it, who comes to a café at 6:30 and leaves with his shoes dry in weather that should have left them spotted with water. The boarding house loomed before him with its warped shutters and door worn shiny at the handle. The gendarme was still outside, shifting his weight to stay warm, his chin tucked low. He straightened when he saw Maigret, but Maigret only nodded and went in. The staircase met him with its same sour smell, a mixture of cabbage, oil, and the faint ammonia of worn wood. He paused halfway up, listening. Somewhere a cough drifted faintly, then silence. On the landing, the sergeant was waiting, his notebook in his hand, his eyes betraying eagerness for activity. "Chief, no one came in since you left. The concierge brought tea, nothing more. The girl across the hall hasn't opened her door again. And the man with the grey sleeve? He hasn't returned." Maigret stepped into the room. The body was still there, unaltered, though something in the air had shifted, perhaps only because Maigret had been outside and brought the night air back with him. He took off his coat and hat, placed them on the chair, then stood for a moment looking at the bed as though reintroducing himself to the man lying upon it. He did not think of him as Jules Martin, nor as Georges Renault. Names shifted too easily. He thought of him as the man who had polished his shoes, who had counted francs twice, who had kept his collar buttoned. He sat, leaned back, and filled his pipe, striking a match. The flame lit his face for an instant, then the smoke curled gently. The sergeant waited for instruction, but Maigret did not speak. He wanted the silence to press again. The building would answer eventually. It was the concierge who came first. She knocked timidly and entered only when Maigret gestured. She set down a chipped cup with steam rising from it. Her shawl slipped as she placed it on the table, and for the first time Maigret noticed the bluish veins along her wrist, delicate as cracks in porcelain. "You've lived here long, madame?" he asked. 23 years, she said with weary pride. "My husband kept the lodge before me. I know every tenant who has passed through. And this one?" He nodded toward the bed. She drew the shawl closer. "He was quieter than most. Paid without quarrel. No drinking, no loud women. He kept his hours. A decent man, I thought. Yet not the name he gave you." Her lips pressed thin. "It happens," she said finally. "People come with pasts they want to leave behind. I am not the police. I keep the stairs clean." Maigret exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting toward her. "And did you ever see him with a woman?" She hesitated, a glance toward the closed door behind her, as if sound might leak through. "Once, a month ago perhaps. Her lady, older than him, with gloves. She didn't stay long. They spoke low. When she left, she looked angry, though she tried not to show it. She did not return." Maigret nodded. He did not press her further. She left, relieved, her slippers whispering down the stairs. When the sound of her steps faded, Maigret leaned forward and picked up the slip of paper again. He turned it in his fingers. A meeting at 6:30, followed by an argument not raised above a whisper, a clerk who coughed and went away with his umbrella, a woman with gloves who came once and left angry, a man who polished his shoes for the rain but never stepped in it. All of it sat in the room with him, layered into the air. The sergeant shifted. "What now, Chief?" Maigret stood and pulled on his coat. "Now we wait until morning. Have the men take the body to the morgue, quietly. I want to know what the doctor finds when he looks deeper. You stay here. If anyone asks questions, you tell them nothing. If the woman with the gloves returns, keep her. If the clerk returns, keep him longer. And you, Chief." "I'll go home," Maigret said. He tamped his pipe, then added, "My wife will be waiting." Outside, the rain had ceased altogether, leaving the city washed and reflective. He walked slowly through the sleeping streets toward Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, where the trees stood dripping in silence. When he reached home, the windows of his apartment glowed faintly. Madame Maigret was waiting, as he had known she would be, a plate kept warm for him. She looked at his face and did not ask questions at once. Only when he had eaten a few bites in silence did she say, "You are late." He nodded, chewing slowly. "A man died in a room with no windows," he said. She folded her hands in her lap. "That is bad for the lungs. Rooms with no windows." He looked at her, his eyes narrowing with a sudden glint. She had not meant more than what she said, yet something stirred in him. The thought of stale air, of newspaper pressed into a vent, of a body lying too calmly. He chewed once more, swallowed, and leaned back. "You're right," he said, half to himself. "It is bad for the lungs." The rest of the meal passed in their accustomed quiet. Later in bed, he listened to the rain starting again against the shutters, softer now, almost like breathing. He thought of the clerk's cough, of the woman's gloves, of the polished shoes. He thought of lungs filling too slowly in a room that could not breathe. And he thought of how in the morning the truth might begin to seep out like the damp through stone, patient and unavoidable. He woke before the light, with the thought of breath still in his mind. The apartment was quiet. Madame Maigret moved softly in the kitchen. The smell of coffee reached him with a steadiness that calmed more than it roused. At the table he ate without appetite, the spoon clicking once against the saucer when he set it down. She said nothing for a while, then only, "You won't forget your scarf. It's damp again today." He nodded, already elsewhere. Rooms without windows, paper pressed into a vent by a hand that didn't want the room to breathe. He kissed her forehead, a habit both of them preferred to leave unremarked, and stepped into the hallway. The morgue was still half asleep when he arrived. Dr. Paul had his coat unbuttoned and his hair untidy, the look of a man stolen from his bed by duty and used to the theft. He did not bother with politeness. He lifted the sheet and spoke in the tone he kept for facts. "Not the heart," he said. "The lungs are heavy, congested. The blood is—" He looked for a word that was not precise and yet more accurate. "Too red. There is no bruising in the mouth, no sign of struggle. Stomach holds a small quantity of alcohol, anisette, I'd say, and the remains of bread. Time of death, between 7 and 9 last evening." His eyes moved to Maigray's pipe as if it might begin speaking on its own. "If you tell me he slept with a flame burning in a room with no air, I won't argue. Would a man lie down like that and not wake?" "If the air gives him nothing to wake to," Dr. Paul said, "he would drowse, feel a kind of fullness in the head, and stop needing to think about breath. It is a quiet way to die. Too quiet. Usually there is vomit. There is none." "Someone tidied him," Maigret said, more to the bare ceiling than to the doctor. "Or he was tidy even in dying," Dr. Paul answered, almost with a shrug. "I can tell you what his lungs have to say. The room will tell you the rest." Maigret thanked him and left, the echo of his steps sounding dull against the tiles. Outside, the air had the pale smell of the river and coal smoke. Not unpleasant, just insistent. He walked without hurry to the river's edge, then turned toward the 11th in a curve that took him first, not to the boarding house, but to a street off the Boulevard Voltaire, where the name Duhamel and Fils Insurance was painted in flaking gold on a glass door. Inside, ledgers slept in tall cabinets, and a clerk with an ink-stained finger watched him, as one watches a man come to ask about a debt. The proprietor, Duhamel, had a beard that exaggerated his authority, and the gentle stubbornness of someone who had explained sums, to too many uncomprehending faces. He recognized the name Vasher, and held a ledger close as if the numbers could be stolen by a glance. "Adrian," he said, tapping a column. "Reliable. He brings us nickels and gratitude. He called on 2 addresses last night on the Boulevard Richard Lenoir. He left his times. Between them he notes Café du Chemin Vert, Contretemps. He does not write more when a thing is personal." "He thinks I do not notice." "And the policy?" Maigret asked. Duhamel leafed back. "Renaud, Georges," he read. "Or Martin." He wrote 2 different names at 2 visits. "People think names are like coats. They change them according to weather. Small death benefit, 1,500 francs. No named beneficiary. Payable to whoever produces the burial bill. 2 premiums in arrears. Would death cancel the arrears?" "We pay if death is genuine," Duhamel said, and looked up with a precise sadness. "We are not monsters." Maigret considered the neat columns, the cramped figures in Vacher's hand, small sums gathered with patience. Was there a woman ever noted? Duhamel thought. A week ago, the laundress sent a bill by hand to the address given. He ran a finger along the page, stopped and smiled at his own memory. He had written Nation Blanchisserie des Fontaines in the margin. Vacher is careful like that. He doesn't like being told where to bring a receipt twice. Maigret left a card, and the kind of thanks that reassured men like Duhamel that he had not come to dismantle their order. From there he took the metro to Nation, where the grey had lifted to a thinner light. The laundry was a small shop with a square of damp floor before the ironing table, and a ringer that squealed like a small complaint whenever someone turned it. The woman behind the counter had the arms of those who iron all day, and the eyes of those who think beyond steam. "Your bands," he said, showing the paper packet he had seen in the wardrobe with the rubber stamp of her shop. "You wrapped shirts for a gentleman." Tall, quiet. He counted money twice. "I wrap shirts for many such," she answered, but she had already reached under the counter for a book of tickets that held the memory he wanted. This one paid late. A woman took the last parcel for him. "Gloves?" he asked, and she nodded, pleased to have the detail recognized. Yes, grey gloves. She smelled of violets, not cheap, old-fashioned perhaps. She said, "For Monsieur Renaud." And when I asked which Renault, she looked at me as if I were foolish and said, "The only one who irons his cuffs the way my father did." She was older than him, tired without admitting it. Her name? She paid in coins and did not say. But she left a note once to be sure we held his shirts if he couldn't pay at once. The laundress flipped again through the book and slid out a small square of paper, creased and kept too long. It said only in round, firm letters, "For G. Archam, keep aside 2 shirts." Hey Maigret held it in his palm a moment. He imagined the hand that had formed the H, the kind of hand that had learned good penmanship in a school that still cared about the line of a loop. He returned the note to the woman, who hesitated, then let him take it. On his way back, he stopped at a tobacconist for matches and stood a moment under the awning, watching people negotiate the wet ground. He saw umbrellas held high, hats tilted, the slight automatic courtesies of bodies avoiding one another without thought. The missing umbrella from the cafe made a small, stubborn space in his head. He climbed the familiar stairs of the boarding house and found the sergeant where he had left him, notebook now fat with nothing. The room had been emptied of its burden during the night. The bed was stripped, the wardrobe still leaning as if tired of holding itself upright. The table with the bottle and 2 glasses remained. The bottle had not moved, and the glasses held their thin rims of scent. He closed the door, stood in the center of the room, and let his eyes fall to the vent. The newspaper plug was still there, the same sagging corner he had eased and let go. He took out his matches and struck one, holding the small flame near the paper. The flame leaned inward and went out, as if sucked toward the dark. He struck another and watched it do the same. He pulled the newspaper free. It came in one dense wad, crumpled hard. The newsprint inked on fingers he did not mind marking. The room breathed, a low exhalation, and something like relief moved through the stale smell. He smoothed a corner of the paper against the table with his palm. The date was yesterday. A cinema advertisement had a circle drawn around it, not heavy, just once and uncorrected. He stared at it briefly, then set the paper aside. He bent to the lamp, which had a jet that could hiss and did when opened a hair. He closed it. The lamp and the vent together could have made a room into a trap, so gentle a man might call it sleep. In the corridor, a door latch clicked softly. Mademoiselle Lise stood there with her cardigan crossed, as if she felt the room breathing again and wasn't sure she liked the change. "It smelled different this morning," she said, without being asked. "Less like yesterday. You woke in the night?" he asked. She nodded. Someone passed it too. Not the clerk, he coughs. Not the metal worker, he snores before midnight. This step was light and stopped outside this door, then went down quickly, as if the person suddenly remembered being late. There was a scent. Not the man's cologne. Something like flowers, violets, Maigret suggested, and she looked at him with a relief that had a little fear mixed in. "Yes," she said. "That." He thanked her and watched her close the door with care, as if the wood itself might listen. He stood very still, hearing only the small noises a building makes when it is forced to resume breathing. On the table, the 2 glasses waited like a pair of eyes that had seen more than they should. He could feel the shape of the story now, not its end, not even its middle, but the way it pressed from one person to another, the way a borrowed umbrella moved through the rain, and a violet scent lingered where it shouldn't have been. He filled his pipe but did not light it, and wrote on a scrap from his pocket the letter H, simple and unadorned, and below it the word umbrella, because sometimes a thing had to be set down twice for its weight to make itself felt. He stayed with the breathing room a few minutes more, listening to the faint new currents find their paths along the skirting and under the door. Then he lifted the overcoat from its hook and set it across the chair back, the heaviness of the cloth pulling the fabric into a familiar curve. In the pocket his fingers found lint, a bus ticket folded on itself, and wedged in a corner a thin rectangle of card with a serrated edge. He drew it out. The ink was purplish, the kind that stains thumb pads even after it dries. Cinéma Beaumarchais, Programme 2, 18h30. No tear across the edge. Not used. He held it a long moment between forefinger and thumb. Yesterday's newspaper had circled a cinema advertisement. The coat held a ticket for that hour. He set the card beside the slip with the penciled 1830, and the two lay together like a question asked twice by 2 different hands. He crouched to the bed and ran his palm slowly along the underside of the mattress. feeling for the shape of what people forget to declare, an envelope, a key, a small packet that announces itself by not belonging. Only dust and a stray button came away, the kind of button that rolls under furniture and is not missed until a cuff opens at the wrong moment. He put it on the table, and it looked suddenly accusing. He took the small oval photograph from the wallet and stood in the doorway where the light from the corridor made a dull rectangle on the floorboards. He knocked at Mademoiselle Lise's door, and when she opened it, a cautious hand's breadth showed her the face without comment. She considered it with a seriousness out of proportion to the little oval, then shook her head. She could be any woman, she said. But the one with the gloves had a mouth that held itself in. This one looks as if she wanted to speak and didn't. It was not an identification. It was something close to pity. He thanked her and went down to the street, where the morning had the washed look of a city that has just finished being scrubbed. He walked to the Beaumarchais. The poster cases were beaded with rain, the actresses' painted mouths too bright in the grey day. Inside, a woman with a coin apron counted her float, lips moving faintly as she added and carried. She looked at his hat at his shoulders and folded her hands without asking who he was. "Last night," he said, placing the intact ticket on the counter, as if it were a neutral coin. A tall man who polished his shoes and counted money twice might have come at the 6:30 program. "Did you see him?" "We see many such men," she answered, but there was no impatience in it. Then she tapped the ticket. "These I remember. We ran out at 1:15. He didn't buy one here. He could have bought it earlier in the day. Some do. To be sure they will come. To be sure they will come. Did a lady come asking for a man? Grey gloves? Violets?" The woman's gaze shifted to a point just to the side of his shoulder, where memory often stands. "Not at 6:30, she said. After 9, when the last show was ending, a lady returned an umbrella to the cloakroom and asked if anyone had left a note for G. We had no note. She apologized as if she had broken a rule and went out quickly. She kept her gloves on even when she fished in her bag for coins. The umbrella. Black, curved handle. Not one of ours. She said it belonged to a cafe. She did not say which, but I know the chemin vert rack. Their handles are nicked all the same way. She lifted a hand and indicated a small notch near her own wrist, as if the nick had a place on a body. Did the man come at all, she thought? Someone stood near the door at 7 and looked in as if the light inside hurt his eyes. He turned away when a couple passed and said, "Pardon, too quickly. I could not see his shoes." He left the cinema with the ticket still unpunched in his pocket. The rain had given up, and the pavements were beginning to show their own color again. At the cafe, the barman pointed to the rack with the absent space, and they stood looking at it together like men at a missing tooth. "It was not returned here," the barman said. But if she told the cinema it belonged to a cafe, perhaps she meant to show she was honest. There was no irony in his voice, only a kind of professional acceptance that people tried to pay their small debts even when their large ones went wrong. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of wet coats and ink. He found Lognon standing by a radiator that gave off more noise than heat, his long face set in its customary grievance. "Your man with the 2 names," Lognon said, without prelude, "has 6 files he could fit, and none he fits well. If you wish, I can fetch you all 6 and you can decide they belong to someone else." "Do," Maigret said mildly. He lit his pipe and waited while Lognon fetched dossiers in a bundle that seemed meant to satisfy an appetite for paper rather than truth. They flipped through addresses in Belleville and Ivry, men who had been Georges until it inconvenienced them, and Jules, when the concierge asked too many questions. None had polished shoes in the margins. None had a clerk who coughed listed among associates. He closed the folders gently and pushed them back as if returning hats to the wrong heads. "It isn't in there," he said. "That is what I said," Lognon replied, gratified to have been right in his gloom. "Your clerk?" "Adrien Vacher. Insurance. Bring him in after he eats his lunch. He will talk better with soup in him than with hunger." Lognon nodded, already resentful of the soup he would not himself have time to eat. From a drawer, he took the oval photograph and, after a moment, slid it back again. Faces in ovals said little in police buildings. The letter H in his pocket on the laundress's note had more weight. On his way out, he stopped in a perfumer's, a narrow shop that smelled of powders and decisions made long ago. The proprietor wore a white coat that conferred a sort of priesthood. Violets, Maigret said. Not modern. Something a woman would have kept to because she had kept it all her life. Violettes de Toulouse, the man answered without hesitation. Or Yardley's violets if she were economical. The first clings, the second announces. He smiled faintly. The women who buy it now are those who do not care that no one else does. Stubborn, often from good families that dwindled quietly. Do any buy it near Nation? 3 shops, the perfumer said, naming them off as one recites a catechism. On Roquette, a mother and daughter. On Charonne, a widow who has been a widow for so long the word has lost its edge. On Beaumarchais, a gentleman who pretends his wife is still alive and buys the smallest bottle. Maigret thanked him without buying anything. He walked the short distance to the Roquette shop and stood outside a moment watching a woman in a hat with netting try not to see herself in the glass. Inside, the daughter served him. The mother watched. When he spoke of violets, the mother's eyes brightened in a way that was not commerce. Not many ask for that, she said, and lifted a bottle with the reverence of a photograph taken down from a mantel. One lady buys it every month. Grey gloves in winter, cotton in summer. She doesn't bargain. She says thank you as if she had finished a prayer. Her name? The mother glanced at the daughter who looked at the scale as if numbers might protect her from names. She writes H.B. on the slip when she sends the maid. The letters blur. If she comes herself, she pays cash. She reached under the counter and produced a pad of receipts no one had asked to see. The last line held an initial and the ghost of a surname the pen had not pressed completely. H. Briss. Something. The address was not written. The words, on delivery, had been crossed out and replaced by nothing. He left his card with the date and the time and a request written so simply it could not be refused without impoliteness. On the pavement, he paused to light his pipe, cupping the match against the thin wind that had risen. He thought of the step, a 2 a.m. that had hesitated at the dead man's door, and then gone down quickly, as if suddenly remembering being late. He thought of an umbrella returned honestly to the cinema, as if debts of that size could be made square, while a larger debt breathed on the bed nearby. He thought of how violets clung to wool, and how, when a woman kept a scent long enough, it stopped being something she wore and became part of the silence she carried with her. When he reached the boarding house again, the sergeant looked up from his notebook with hope that had learned not to show itself. "Anything, Chief?" "Enough to eat lunch," Maigret said, and set his hat on the table beside the unpunched ticket and the penciled hour. He poured a measure from the anisette bottle into the chipped glass, not to drink, but to let the scent rise. Then he sat and let the room breathe around him, because the people he wanted had begun, without knowing it, to walk toward him. The anisettes. Sweet ghost lingered in the chipped glass. It seemed almost indecent among the other smells that had returned with the room's breath. The sergeant had gone to fetch a sandwich, leaving his notebook splayed like a gull on the chair. Maigret sat with his hat on his knee, the unpunched cinema ticket beside the penciled hour, and listened to the building resume its small commerce with the day. Somewhere below, water went through a pipe with a tired sound. A broom knocked once against a stair. He did not look up when the landing creaked. He had already caught the faint powdery trace that reached a second before the knock, violets that had learned to keep to themselves. She did not wait to be invited. She opened the door just wide enough for her to enter, and closed it with the quiet of someone used to doors that might disapprove. The gloves were grey and old-fashioned, the stitching along the fingers still firm. She was not young. Her hat had a net that could be lowered in churches. She took in the stripped bed, the table with the bottle and 2 glasses, the overcoat on the chair, and then, last, Maigret's face. Grief did not pass over her features. Something more stubborn did, like someone holding an object steady in her hands that wanted to tremble. "You're the inspector," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he answered, and did not ask her name. He had found that names volunteered under silence were truer. She looked at the glasses as if calculating which one had been offered to her and which kept back for later. "I returned the umbrella," she said, the words laid carefully on the table between them like coins. "To the cinema." I knew it was from a cafe, but I didn't know which. And I thought—" She stopped, as if the sentence had written itself too neatly, and she no longer trusted its grammar. "You thought debts should be squared while one can," Maigret said mildly. She inclined her head, a gesture that belonged to another decade. "He borrowed without asking. He wouldn't have liked that after." Her eyes went to the overcoat. "He was tidy. He counted money twice," Maigret said. "He polished his shoes when it rained and didn't go out." Her mouth moved as if a smile considered itself and declined. "He would polish them for courage," she said. "Some men pour a drink. He polished." He nodded toward the chair. She sat without removing her gloves, as if her bare hands were not for police rooms. The violets in the wool of her coat were not loud. They had the persistence of a habit. "Last night," Maigret said, not asking, not accusing. "I went to the Beau Marché," she said, "at 6:30. He had said—" She glanced at the unpunched ticket and her eyes paused a fraction too long. "He had said perhaps the cinema would be easier. People look at the screen and not at you. That is a kind of privacy you can buy. You asked for a note for GR, he said. Her eyes returned from the ticket to his. He changes letters, she said simply. They were always his, but he changed them. I keep mine. You did not see him there. I went inside and waited until the light on the door burned my eyes. I came out again and stood under the awning. The rain made a curtain. He didn't come." She spoke without hurry, not to convince him of anything, but as if to set in order objects a maid had dusted badly. "I thought if he went to the cafe first, he would be ashamed to find me at the cinema, so I would go away and leave a way open for tomorrow." Her gloved fingers touched the edge of the table and withdrew, as if the wood were still warm from a glass. "I returned the umbrella because it was in my hand. It was in my hand." At 2 in the morning, Maigret said, someone went up the stairs and stopped at this door. "Light steps, violets." She lowered her head the width of a coin. "I came," she said. I had not slept. I thought perhaps he had fallen ill and was ashamed to send for a doctor. He was proud in the wrong direction. When there was no light under the door, I told myself he slept. I went away. If I had knocked— Her voice did not change, but her gloved fingers pressed harder together until the leather made a small sound like breath. "The concierge saw you once before," he said. "A month ago." She said, "You left angry and did not return." "I was angry with myself," she said. He had said a thing that was true, and I did not forgive truth that day. What thing? That I would not leave my name. Her eyes flicked to the wardrobe without moving her head. He thought names were coats. "I have one, and mine is worn on the inside." Maigret waited. The silence settled into the corners. When he did not fill it, she added, "Brissot. Hélène." As if the syllables were coins passed across a counter, and she had watched too many of them leave her hand. "Hélène Brissot," he repeated, not writing it. "You left a note with the laundress to hold his shirts. I pay where I can," she said. "He would not let me pay here." Her glance touched the bed again and moved away. "He said a man should at least be the kind of man who pays for his bed. You knew him as Georges. I met him as Georges. He had been other names before me. I told him once that he could not keep air from finding itself. He laughed and said there are rooms where air does not find much." She looked at the small vent, the plug of newspaper smoothed and set aside, and for the first time something like fear crossed her face. "I did not do that," she said quietly before he asked. "I could not have done that and then come back at 2 to listen to the door breathe nothing." "The lamp," he said. "He kept it low," she said. "He did not like the dark to touch his face all at once. He said an old hotel taught him that. Anisette. He liked to hold the glass," she said. "The taste—" She stopped herself with the neat control of someone who had said too much exactly once in her life and learned the lesson too well. "You will ask the little man who coughs," she added. "He makes men speak because the coins in his hand are all that they have not promised away." "Vacher," Maigret said. "He came at 9 and knocked and did not insist." "He would not insist," she said. "He has learned to be polite with poverty." She looked at the unpunched ticket again. "He bought it to please me," she said, as if offering him a fact that would neither help nor hinder and might for that very reason be true. "We thought once we would go to the pictures like ordinary people." Then he said the pictures made him restless. He preferred to sit at a table and not speak. "Why did you come here a month ago?" he asked. "To say I would not come again," she said. "A woman cannot spend a life in doorways. Then I came again. We are made of contradictions more than we admit. He did not tell her that in this he found her ordinary. He stood and moved to the overcoat on the chair, took from its pocket the cinema ticket, and held it out to her. Not used, he said. She did not take it. Keep it, she said. It proves nothing and too much. The sergeant returned with his sandwich and stopped, chewing once without having yet taken a bite, the smell of violets meeting the smell of ham. He stepped back into the corridor and shut the door almost inaudibly, the way housekeepers do when they know they have entered a room that is already occupied by something they cannot help. When you left at 2, Maigret said, you went down quickly. I remembered it was late, she said, and the corner of her mouth moved again in that almost smile that had no happiness in it. Late is a different hour when you are a woman on stairs, he nodded. Do you know the clerk by name? I call him the cough, she said. That is unkind. I am unkind often enough to people who do not deserve it. He looked at me once in a mirror and then away on purpose. I almost thanked him. She rose. The violet scent deepened for a moment, where she stood and then steadied. Will you take me somewhere to write my name? She asked. Or shall I leave it as I did before and let you find it out of pieces? You have left it already, he said. Dames Roquette and Nation. He lifted his pipe unlit in a small salute that was not irony. I will send someone for you when I have to. Until then, if you have an umbrella, keep it. She dipped her head and the net on her hat made a brief grey over her eyes. At the door she paused. He would not have left the room like that, she said, looking at the vent and the lamp that was now shut tight. He was tidy even in despair. When she had gone, the room felt larger and more empty, as if a piece of furniture had been removed and only its pale outline on the floor remained. The sergeant came in with his sandwich held respectfully at his side. Her name? He asked. Hélène, Maigret said. And violets. He took the matchbook and struck a flame, then held it near the vent for a second, more out of habit than need. The flame stood straight and then wavered toward the dark, as if it remembered something. He let it go out and set the stub in the chipped glass. On the table, the unpunched ticket and the penciled hour lay like two hands that had reached for the same thing and failed to touch. He would see Vacher after soup. He would visit a perfumer who spoke catechisms. He would ask the cinema woman to lower her voice and remember the shape of a man at a doorway. For now he only sat with the room that had not breathed until morning and thought of a man who polished his shoes for courage and a woman who returned an umbrella to the wrong place because it was the only right thing left within reach. He waited for the soup hour to pass. The room held steady, as if it understood that what mattered next would not be found in its corners. The sergeant returned, crumbs brushed from his coat sleeve with a conscientiousness that would have served in a church. Maigret sat with the unpunched ticket and the penciled hour side by side the way one sets two chairs for guests who are late. He did not light his pipe. The smell of violets had thinned to a memory, and the anisette had lost even its ghost. Footsteps came up the stair with the authority of someone sent rather than someone arriving. Lognon first, long-faced, carrying his grievance like an umbrella. Behind him Vacher, hat in hand, scarf looped twice. The cough halted somewhere in his throat as if it had been told to behave. He looked smaller in daylight. The cheap cologne was there but diminished, as if diluted by a morning rain. Sit, Maigret said, not unkindly. He did not point to the bed. He gestured to the chair and Vacher took it as a favor. His eyes could not help but go to the stripped mattress, then away to the table, then back to Maigret's face. Gray's face. I saw him last night, Maigret said. I saw him at the café, Vacher said. His fingers worried the brim of his hat. I waited. He came late. We spoke. He left first. He stopped, pulled the cough back into himself. I followed after I finished my glass. I came here at 9. I knocked. I heard nothing. I put my ear to the door. There was a sound, a small sound like a lamp makes when someone has turned it too low. I went away. You did not knock longer. I collect small sums, Vacher said, and for the first time his voice had something like life in it. I know when a door wants to be left alone. There is pride behind such doors. If you knock too long, pride turns to anger, and you have nothing to collect next week. You were here another night, Maigret said. Inside. Vacher's gaze slid toward the corridor where Mademoiselle Lise's door sat with its careful latch. Once, he admitted. He did not want the lodge to see me. He said the walls listen. He poured a glass and I wet my lips with it, and we talked like men who do not wish to be overheard by a staircase. He asked questions. What kind of questions? What happens if a man dies and is paid irregularly? If there is no beneficiary named, who can bring a burial bill? Whether a company like ours pays faster than a parish. Vacher's fingers had stilled. His eyes were on the table, not as if he were lying, but as if the grain of the wood might help him arrange memory into words. I told him what the book allows. If a death is certain, if there is no suspicion, if the papers are in order, we pay the undertaker who brings the invoice. He nodded. He said men should pay for their bed and for their hole. I remember that because it was said like something he had practiced once in his head. And you? Maigret asked quietly. I told him men should stay alive and keep paying, Vacher said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not with humor but with a tiredness that knew its own insufficiency. He smiled as if he forgave me the smallness of my work. You wrote contretemps in your ledger, Maigret said. That is a polite word. It means I failed to do what I came to do, Vacher answered. He did not give me the 2 weeks. He promised tomorrow. He looked up then, directly. I know what you think, that a man asking such questions is arranging something dark. I think he was arranging not to be a burden. There is a difference. The 2 glasses, Maigret said, and slid one a finger's width so that its rim caught the light. Who drank from the second? Vacher's breath hitched. Not last night, he said. It was another time. He paused too when he talks of difficult things. It is a way to feel less alone while still being alone. He said that once, not to me, to the glass. You saw the vent? Maigret asked. Vacher frowned, surprised by the word. The room, it had a smell like wool that has been warmed too long. Not strong. I thought only that he kept the lamp low, because he hated the sudden dark. He told me that. He said he always left a light burning so he would not wake into nothing. His eyes had gone to the small grate now bare of paper. I did not see that. If I had seen a newspaper there, I would have pulled it out without thinking. We do such things in winter. You borrowed no umbrella, Maigret said. You have your own. I do, Vacher answered, and put a hand on the curved handle as if to prove that a man could at least possess one object completely. When I left the café, he had the cafés. He held it like someone to whom it does not belong. You saw a woman last night? Maigret asked. Only my own loneliness, Vacher said simply. It has the shape of a woman in certain lights. Lognon made a small noise at that. Outrage and amusement mixed uneasily, but Maigret did not look at him. He reached into the overcoat and put the cinema ticket on the table in front of Vacher. He bought this, he said. He did not use it, Vacher stared. He wanted to do something that made him feel like everyone else, he said almost to himself. And then he did not. He came here, to a room that did not breathe, Maigret said. Silence settled. Outside, a cart went past with a metallic rattle, and the building shook a little, as if acknowledging the city beyond its walls. Vacher's cough escaped and was caught again. A small dog that had slipped its leash. Who is H? Maigret asked and watched him the way one watches a glass for the first tremor. A letter, Vacher said. He would not speak her name to me. He said once that if a man cannot give a woman anything but his need, he should give her his absence. I told him that was a collector's sentiment, not a lover's. He smiled as if I had tried. Maigret let him sit with that. He reached for the overcoat again and drew from the pocket the bus ticket he had found earlier, folded twice. He unfolded it on the table and smoothed it with a palm. Line 86, he said. Chemin vert to Bastille. Punched at 6:08. He bought his cinema ticket in the afternoon, Vacher said, and at 6 he rode toward the place where he did not go. You know these times by heart, Maigret observed. I know the habits of men who are a day late and a franc short, Vacher said. We all try to be on time for the wrong things. Lognon shifted, impatient with the talk that sounded to him like philosophy and to Maigret like confession. Chief, he said, do you want me to hold him? For what? Maigret asked without moving his eyes from Vacher. For having a cough, Vacher supplied almost kindly. He stood then, not as if to leave in triumph or panic, but as if the chair had been lent to him and he had kept it too long. If you need me, I am at Duhamel and Phil's after 3. Before that, I'm a shadow on staircases. He reached for his hat and then did something small that did not suit him. He touched the back of the stripped bed with 2 fingers, the way a man touches a pew after a funeral. He didn't like to owe, he said, and went out. When they were alone, Lognon exhaled derisively. Poetry, he said. He tells you poetry and you let him go. He told me more than that, Maigret said. He lit his pipe at last, and the first pull filled the room with something that felt like a decision made without being spoken. He told me the time a man chose to be ordinary and failed at it. He told me a lamp left low for fear of the dark. He told me he would have pulled paper from a vent if he had seen it. He did not lie well where it mattered. And the woman? Lognon pressed. She comes with violets at 2 in the morning and does what? Listens to him not breathe? That is a story a concierge tells to feel important. The concierge did not invent violets, Maigret said, nor the umbrella that found its way to a cloakroom that was not its home. He tapped ash into the chipped glass, watched the grey dust settle in the clear sweetness that clung to the bottom. It is not a murder we are in, Lognon. It is a set of small decencies and one neglect. Whose neglect? Lognon asked, thin-lipped. The kind that comes from pride, Maigret said, and stood. He put the cinema ticket back beside the penciled hour, arranged them so their corners almost touched. Have someone bring Hélène Brissot to the quay at 5. Not with a summons. With an invitation written as if for a person who wears gloves, because her hands know fewer objects than her heart. Lognon made the face he reserved for duties that offended his sense of how the world ought to be. He went, rolling his shoulders into his coat as if it were a burden. Maigret remained a moment longer. He went to the vent and held a match there. The flame stood, then leaned, then went out softly. He thought of a man who polished his shoes for courage and chose a bed because it represented payment done, and of a woman who returned an umbrella to the wrong counter because it was the one debt she could pay that night. He gathered his hat and overcoat and, before leaving, turned the lamp knob shut until it would not give another hiss, as if in that small act he could return breath to a room that had misunderstood what it meant to keep a man safe. At 5, the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres had the end-of-day smell of paper that had been turned too many times and wet wool beginning to cool. Maigret asked for coffee that came in 2 thick cups, and he let the steam rise without drinking. Hélène Brissot arrived as if entering a doctor's waiting room. Hat net lowered halfway, gloves precise, a calm that looked learned rather than natural. He did not have her sit opposite his desk. He took the small round table near the window, where the river light flattened the city into a single grey tone and made faces simpler. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if it were a favour done to him personally. She inclined her head and, after a small pause, rested the tips of her gloves on the edge of the table. The violets were fainter here, overtaken by ink and coffee, but they persisted. "You told me this morning that you waited at the cinema and went away," he began. "You returned an umbrella you believed belonged to a cafe. Then later you climbed the stairs where he lived and listened at the door. I have not asked you how the umbrella came into your hand." She did not start. She had brought the answer with her and decided now to let it be seen. "We passed on the Boulevard Beaumarchais," she said. "It was after 7. The rain had become mist and made a veil around the lamps. I had left the cinema because the picture light hurt my eyes. He came from the direction of the cafe. He saw me and hesitated, as if he might cross to the other side of the street, and then decided not to insult me with that. He did not stop. He put the umbrella into my hand as he passed and said, 'Return this where it should be,' and then added, 'I am going where I should be.'" He did not look back. Maigret let the words stand in the air and take their shape. "You understood him." "I understood what a proud man says when he has arranged not to be a burden," she replied. I did not follow. There are moments when following is indecent, and moments when it is necessary. I have often chosen the wrong one. She lifted the coffee and drank as if to give her hands something to do. At the cinema cloakroom I asked if it belonged to them. When they said no, I told them it was a cafe, and that I did not know which. I thought I would have time in the morning to take it to every cafe on the street if I had to. I am a woman who fills her hours with small corrections. "You came at 2, he said. I could not sleep. I thought if he had been ill he would refuse to send for help. He hated being seen unprepared. I climbed quietly. There was no line of light. I listened and the door answered with nothing. I told myself I was behaving like a sentimental girl and went away. In the street a cat crossed. and I took that as a sign in favor of dignity. We improvise signs when we do not want to act. He did not console her. He watched her set the cup down exactly on the wet circle it had made, as if not to leave 2 marks. How long did you know him? A long time in the way that does not appear on paper, she said. He kept a bookseller's stall once, then a desk in a shipping office. My husband, when he still had opinions, said he had the hands of a man who would always be 1 chair away from where decisions are made. I met him in a waiting room like this one, only there the chairs were hard and the radiator clanged. He asked me the time and then apologized for asking. Some men apologize for existing even while they fill a room. You helped him, Maigret said. I kept a laundry bill from being embarrassing, a shirt from being late, a pair of cuffs from being frayed beyond repair. He allowed that much. He would not let me pay rent. He said a man should at least pay for the roof over his head and the hole in the ground which would later replace it. That sentence has traveled, Maigret said quietly. He said it to your cough clerk as well. She nodded, unsurprised that his words had gone where he could not. He liked to practice sentences. He thought if he could say a thing well, he might be able to live it. Did you ever see him block a vent? Leave a lamp hissing. She recoiled, not in show, but as if a muscle had been touched that flinched by itself. No, she said. He feared drafts like a child, but he would not have done that. He would have loosened his tie with distaste, and spoken of coal gas as if it were an impolite guest who refused to go home. If the room did not breathe, it was because he believed he would need only a little more breath. Doctor says the lungs were heavy and the blood too red, Maigret said. It was quiet. She closed her eyes for a single breath and then opened them. He would have made death tidy, she said. He made everything tidy that could be, and when he couldn't, he made it look as if he had. Maigret did not write. He reached into his pocket and placed the unpunched cinema ticket on the table between them, the purplish ink dulled by the day. He bought this, he said. He didn't use it. To please me, she answered with neither pride nor sorrow, so that I could say later that we had gone to the pictures like ordinary people, and we would both know it wasn't true. They sat with that for a while. The river roped light along the ceiling and let it go again. A clerk passed in the corridor with a sheaf of papers held to his chest as if the heat of his body could keep them from cooling. You are alone, Madame Brissot? Maigret asked finally. I am a widow in a building where other people's radios keep me company, she said. There is a niece who visits on Sundays and leaves with biscuits. I am not tragic. I am only stubborn. You will want to see to his burial, he said, not asking. Of course. The gloves tightened on her fingers. He wanted not to be a public charge. I can spare the undertaker humiliations part. The policy will pay the bill when it is presented, Maigret said, and he set a card down with Duhamel's name written in his hand. No one will hurry you. Give the invoice to this man and he will do the rest. I will speak to him first so that his tone is the right one. She looked at the card and did not touch it. Will you write he did not make trouble? She asked. People like to write that in church registers and in police notebooks, that the dead were no trouble. It comforts those who remain. I will write that he made things simple where he could, he said. And where he could not, he tried to stand in the way of no one. She rose then. The chair legs made a small sound like a sigh. You will not need me again, she said, making it not a hope but a recognition. But if you do, I will come and sit where you tell me and keep my gloves on. He walked her to the door. In the corridor, men glanced and then glanced away as they always did, when a woman passed in a place made for men. At the stairs she paused. You have the look of someone who remembers rooms, she said. If you see one without windows, open something before you leave. I will, he said. When she was gone, he returned to the little table and folded the cinema ticket once, then twice, then not at all, letting it lie. He telephoned Duhamel and spoke in the tone that made men in ledgers say yes without feeling they had been moved. He called Dr. Paul and asked him to be careful with his phrases on the certificate. He sent Lognon home by way of the perfumers only to say thank you. It would make the man's evening orderly. Night had come while he did these small tasks. He put on his coat and left the building and walked, not toward the boarding house, but toward the Café du Chemin Vert. The barman was polishing the same patch of zinc with the same cloth. On the rack, the missing space still gaped. Maigret took the umbrella he had brought with him, the clerk's curved handle worn smooth by an honest hand, and set it in the empty notch. The barman watched and nodded, as if teeth once lost sometimes found their way back into a mouth. Outside, the rain had begun again, a fine, obstinate drizzle that made the city blur at the edges. He lit his pipe and stood under the awning, watching people pass with their collars up, each carrying their private weather. He thought of a man who bought a ticket for an hour he could not bear, and of a woman who returned what she could to where it belonged, of a clerk who learned to stop knocking, and a concierge who learned to hear too much. Not a murder, no villain to deliver to a door, only the neat geometry of pride and the soft, injurious sum of small hesitations. He finished the bowl, tapped it out against the sole of his shoe, and went home the long way, letting the city breathe around him because he could. The next morning was clear, the streets rinsed clean by the night's drizzle. From the window of his office, Maigret watched the river move with its indifferent patience, barges sliding under bridges as if nothing in the world could hasten or delay them. On his desk lay only two objects, the cinema ticket still unpunched, and the slip of paper with 1830 penciled in a hurried hand. He studied them without touching, as though they were enough to summon the whole shape of the affair. It had not been murder. There would be no trial, no articles in the papers with headlines straining for drama. A man had died because pride and loneliness had conspired with a poorly vented room. Yet behind it, there had been a woman's careful loyalty, a clerk's awkward decency, and a concierge's reluctant knowledge. He thought of the way each had approached the door of that windowless room, one with violets, one with a cough, one with slippers that knew every step. None had forced their way in, though each had reasons. Perhaps any one of them might have saved him, or perhaps not, or perhaps not. In the end, the truth was only this. Jules Martin, or Georges Renault, or whatever name he wore, had prepared for death the way he prepared for life. Tidy, resigned, careful not to owe too much. He polished his shoes for courage, he counted his francs twice, he kept his collar buttoned. He had asked the clerk what happened to unpaid premiums because he wanted not to leave shame behind him. And he gave the woman an umbrella to return because he could not give her more. Maigret lit his pipe. The first drawer filled the room with warmth that made the morning seem less sharp. He thought of Madame Maigret's words, spoken without intention. Rooms without windows are bad for the lungs. It had been that simple. The lamp hissing, the air choked off by newspaper. A man who lay down to rest thinking he would rise again, and never did. By noon, the paperwork was in order. The undertaker had the bill. Duhamel would see the policy paid, and Hélène Brissot would be spared the humiliation her friend had feared. Vacher would go on climbing stairs and knocking lightly, the concierge would resume hearing too much, and Mademoiselle Lise would continue to sleep with a pillow pressed over her ears. Nothing changed, and yet everything had been seen. That evening, Maigret sat in his corner of the Brasserie Dauphine with a beer untouched, watching the street through the misted glass. Paris moved as it always did. People hurrying with collars up, children darting between puddles, men ducking into cafes to shake off the damp. Ordinary lives, each with their quiet tragedies hidden beneath coats and hats. He thought of the room with no windows one last time, then let it go. There would always be another room, another door that held its silence too long. For now he was only a man with a pipe, watching the city breathe around him, and that was enough.